Top of the morning to you. Welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines: 2 killed, 7 injured after Russian missile attack on Zaporizhzhia. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu says Moscow to build up forces in the West to counter NATO threats. Plus, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Ukraine to receive additional Patriot air defense systems from Germany. Thank you so much for joining us. At least 2 people have been killed and 7 others injured in an apparent missile attack by Russia on the Ukrainian city of Zaporizhzhia, according to reports. Ukrainian officials say they had earlier reported 3 deaths, but unfortunately, 1 person was resuscitated as doctors were assisted by police paramedics at the scene. Zaporizhzhia City Council Secretary Anatoly Kortiev earlier said that Russia had hit a residential area of the city. Windows were blown out in several buildings. In Donetsk, a child was killed and 2 people were injured when a Ukrainian artillery shell hit a 2-story building. This is coming from the Russian-appointed head of the region, Denis Pushilin. The Donetsk region in eastern Ukraine had been partly under the control of pro-Russian separatists since 2014, until Moscow announced last year that it was annexing the province. Russia, which early last year sent its troops to Ukraine for what it calls a special military operation, says Ukrainian forces shell the Russian-controlled parts of the Donetsk region on a daily basis. Separately, the Interfax news agency cited Russian-appointed officials in Ukraine's southerly Zaporizhzhia region as saying 4 civilians had been killed and 2 wounded by Ukrainian shelling in the village of Trudovy, about 15 kilometers east of the town of Tokmak. Still in Donetsk, Ukraine's national police released footage showing its forces evacuating civilians and their pets from the region's frontline town. Now, in a press statement accompanying the video, which was released on Wednesday, the police say that heavy Russian shelling delayed the evacuation process and that some shells targeted the evacuation vehicles. The video showed a civilian in an undisclosed location with her cat after a ride with the officers in an armored vehicle coming out of the area. Over the winter, Russian forces repeatedly assaulted the region, with Ukraine saying it has inflicted significant losses to them. A blast has rocked an optics and optical electronics factory in the town of Sergiev Posad. That's about 50 kilometers northeast of Moscow on Wednesday, injuring at least 45 people. Local authorities say the explosion appeared to have occurred in a warehouse containing pyrotechnic equipment. The popular online news channel MASH said it had been rented by a pyrotechnics firm. According to the mayor's office, 23 people were admitted to hospital, including 6 in intensive care. Footage on social media showed a huge column of smoke and high-rise buildings with windows blown out.
Здание суда, что ли, нахуй? Аж дом шатало, блядь.
Now, the Zagorsk Optical and Mechanical Plant produces optical equipment for industrial and healthcare applications, as well as for the Russian security forces. Local media reported that a major rescue operation involving more than 150 people was underway, citing the emergencies industry as saying it had sent its lead units and the leader to the site of the blast. A Russian agency quoted local authorities as saying a state of emergency has been declared in the area. Russia said on Tuesday that its forces had struck a Ukrainian military command post, while Ukraine said it had not hit, or rather that it had hit Russian radar stations, according to official briefings from the two countries. The Russian Defense Ministry issued a battle report saying the Russian army destroyed Ukrainian military projects, including tanks, armored vehicles, and other equipment in the directions of areas including Kupiansk, Krasny Liman, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson. The Russian forces also hit a Ukrainian command post on the front line. The Russian air defense troops intercepted 5 HIMARS multiple rocket launchers and 17 unmanned drones from Ukraine. On the same day, the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces issued a report saying that in the past 24 hours, the Ukrainian army carried out strikes on Russian troops and equipment concentration areas, destroying a Russian Ka-52 helicopter and reconnaissance drones, 5 artilleries, and 2 radar stations. Now let's talk to Mr. Peter Dickinson, publisher of Business Ukraine magazine Lviv Today, who is editor at the Odessa Review, joining us out of Ukraine. A very good morning to you and a warm welcome to the program.
Good morning. Nice to join you.
I wonder how things are in Zaporizhzhia. From the reports that we have, that 2 have been killed, about 7 others injured in the latest escalation or continuation of the conflict there, where also, isn't that where the nuclear power plant is? And Ukraine is accusing Russia of this attacks on Zaporizhzhia. Could you speak to this issue that what exactly do you think the Russians' intentions are in causing any firefights in Zaporizhzhia? Shouldn't that be the place where they will the most avoid?
Yeah, well, the most recent bombings in Zaporizhzhia took place overnight, and we have reports of a number of civilian casualties, unfortunately. Sadly, this is not new. Russia has been frequently bombing civilian sites, very often targeting residential buildings, particularly at night when people are at home, essentially sleeping in their beds and are most vulnerable. So the presumed objective of the Russians in these attacks on civilian residential targets is a terror motive. They're seeking to break Ukraine's morale and to create a sense that nowhere in the country is safe. Now, you mentioned the Zaporizhzhia atomic energy plant, the nuclear plant, and that is in fact the largest plant in Europe. It's a very, very comprehensive facility with 6 reactors, the largest in the continent. So obviously that is a huge potential risk of a major ecological disaster. But Zaporizhzhia is a major city. It's a city of over 750,000 people. It's one of the largest cities in southern Ukraine. So fighting in Zaporizhzhia per se does not necessarily mean there's any danger of the nuclear power plant becoming caught up in firefights, in artillery exchanges or anything of the like. So I would not necessarily read too much into this latest attack in the context of the atomic energy plant, although of course it is alarming. But Zaporizhzhia itself is a frontline city. It's not far away from where the heaviest fighting is taking place along the front lines. So again, the primary objective of Russian attacks on the city is to undermine the morale of the Ukrainian civilian population and also to undermine the morale of the troops who are on the front lines nearby.
Would you be aware, Mr. Dickinson, that there are reports that a Chechen fighter unit is in the Zaporizhzhia region sent by the Russians to help police that particular area? We hear that this Chechen unit is very visible in that area, and there are reports across some international media that these men patrol the area of Zaporizhzhia, especially the nuclear power plant. They stop people in their tracks ask them for their ID cards and what have you. They are better equipped than the Russian army, regular forces who are in control of that particular region. Could you speak to this issue of Chechen fighters in Zaporizhzhia and possibly what any motives Asman Kadyrov, the Chechen leader, has and how his posture is concerning Chechen fighters in this war?
Well, I don't have any conclusive evidence or information regarding the Chechen units that you mentioned, but I am familiar with such reports. It certainly would be consistent with Russia's general policy in Ukraine. The Chechen troops occupy a very specific place within the Russian armed forces. Russia, of course, fought 2 wars against Chechnya, which is a republic, an ethnic republic within Russia, which attempted to, which declared independence, attempted to establish independence in the 1990s following the collapse of the Soviet Union. That independence bid was ruthlessly crushed in 2 wars in the 1990s and the early 2000s. Indeed, Vladimir Putin essentially established his credentials as the leader of Russia by crushing the second Chechen independence push in the early 2000s. By all accounts, it was a savage and very brutal war. The civilian death toll was in the tens of thousands. Amongst a total population of Chechnya, which was only around 1.5 million. So it was a very, very high death toll there in Chechnya. And the regime established following the war was essentially a loyalist regime, a Putin loyalist regime, which was given a very wide amount of autonomy within Russia as their kind of payback for being loyal to the Putin regime. So Chechnya remains within Russia. It has a very high degree of autonomy, and Ramzan Kadyrov, the ruler of Chechnya, is able to operate very much as a warlord, as a law unto himself within Chechnya. In return for that, they have provided very loyal forces to the Kremlin, to Putin. So Putin uses these forces in Ukraine as a kind of elite, as a shock troops who are used for disciplinary measures. They're used to discipline the Russian forces themselves. There are a lot of reports of Chechen troops behind the front lines shooting and disciplining Russian troops who refuse to fight, for example. So it would be absolutely consistent if the Chechens are also being used in the very sensitive areas around the Zaporizhzhia atomic energy plant, which is a strategically important object in Russia's war in Ukraine.
The IAEA has made no bones about the fact that that nuclear power plant, which you've reminded us that is the biggest in Europe, and that they should be careful with it. And reports coming out of that plant indicate that some of the experts have abandoned, they've fled the power plant. Some of the safety protocols are not observed by the Russians who are in charge of the power plant. Are you concerned that the Russians, I've said it before, are playing Russian roulette with the power plant, and the Ukrainians, are they doing enough to keep that place secure as much as they can do?
Certainly I'm concerned. Yes, I think everybody in Ukraine is very concerned. It's probably, everybody in Ukraine lives with a myriad of concerns in these days, of course. But I think probably the Zaporizhzhia atomic energy plant is maybe the top concern, or certainly one of. Of course, it's important to remind your audience that Ukraine was the scene of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986. At the time, the world's largest nuclear disaster. So Ukrainians are very familiar with the catastrophic consequences if things go wrong at a nuclear power plant. Russia has, as you say, is playing Russian roulette, is using the plant as a tool to intimidate Ukrainians and intimidate the whole world, in fact. If there were to be a disaster at this plant, the consequences would not be contained to Ukraine itself. They would be certainly on a European scale, potentially on a global scale. The scale of the tragedy could be, by all means, could be global. So it is essentially a gun to the head of the entire international community. And Russia has been fairly unsubtle, I would say, about these threats. They've made it quite clear that this is a danger. Russian commanders have been recorded making quite explicit comments to their own troops, saying that if they cannot hold this plant, that they will destroy it. There have been widespread reports of mining of the plant. There is open source information showing that the plant has been heavily militarized, and reports of the staff of the plant, a large number of Ukrainians who are essentially being terrorized there, who are being held hostage, who are being, in many cases, mistreated. Some have been abducted and have disappeared, whose fates are unknown. So the whole situation is extremely alarming. You mentioned what Ukraine is doing. Ukraine really can't do very much. The plant is under Russian occupation. All Ukraine can do is liberate the plant, essentially. But of course, they have to be very, very careful about that. And they are essentially, in my understanding, attempting to bypass the plant and hopefully cut it off and liberate it by liberating a wider stretch of territory in order to force the Russians to withdraw from that area, because they really cannot risk the potential for engaging in intensive military operations anywhere near that plant. It's far, far too sensitive for that.
How far is the plant, would you know, from the recent skirmishes involving the attacks in Zaporizhzhia? Is it a great distance? It's a significant distance, yes. It's not close. I mean, we're talking about tens of kilometers. So, obviously there is a danger. But again, I underline, Zaporizhzhia is a large city. So, although the plant is Zaporizhzhia, the attacks also, that does not indicate that they were nearby physically. It was very heartbreaking for me to see a picture of some women and I think some children accompanying a woman to a health center of some sort, trying to buy iodine tablets because they were afraid that there was going to be some sort of escape of the gas or some sort of reactor failure. And iodine was supposed to be something that you use to help treatment of any sort of radiation. Have you heard of that? Yes, that is something that that is something that we're seeing across Ukraine. There are periodic periods of intensified alarm, and one of the indications of that is that supplies of iodine are sold out in many of the smaller towns around the country. People are stocking up on that. Again, I underline, this is a country that experienced the Chernobyl disaster and the consequences of that disaster. In many ways, still lives with the consequences of that disaster. So this is something that people are very familiar with. It's real. It's not just a theoretical for them. And so they are well aware of the potential for a disaster, and they know how quickly the consequences could spread. They're certainly looking to buy medicines. People are monitoring the situation. And any major disaster, any indications of an explosion or a major escalation at the plant, I think, would spark a massive outflow of people from Ukraine, certainly from the immediate vicinity around Zaporizhzhia plant, but also probably from other parts of Ukraine into the neighbouring EU. So it is potentially a trigger for a major humanitarian catastrophe, again, which would be felt far beyond the borders of Ukraine. Exactly. We understand that the plume will go over a whole portion of Europe. But Mr. Dickinson, that is a plume of radiation and the fallout if there's any disaster or accident at the reactor. Mr. Dickinson, at this point of the war, with the mediation efforts seeming to have stalled, aside from the Saudi Arabia conference, and I want your buy-in on that, whether it's as much of an advantage as the countries that participated in it, or the estimation of the United States and Ukraine about it is indicative of how useful it was. When Russia doesn't want to have anything to do with it because obviously they weren't invited. Was it fair not to have Russia on the table with those other nations?
Well, it was obviously a very specific decision. It was obviously no accident. The decision was made that this event would be focused on creating a consensus within the international community regarding the peace process. If they can move towards a consensus, and all parties seem to indicate that there was some positive movement, although certainly no major breakthroughs.
Sorry, but does that not? Sorry to interrupt you. Does that not alienate Russia when you don't invite them?
Yes, absolutely. Russia. It was intended to alienate Russia. It was. I would use the word rather than alienate. I would say isolate. The primary objective of the event was to highlight for Russia that it is internationally isolated. This is why it was so important to see China attending the event, given the fact that China has long been seen as Russia's main international ally or supporter in this war. So it was very important to demonstrate that actually China is prepared to at least engage with, if not necessarily agree with, the broader international community in attempts to find a solution that will suit Ukraine and that will isolate Russia. There can be no equivalence here. This is not two sides of an argument. Russia is wrong. Russia is an invader. Russia has broken almost every recognized international law or regulation. Ukraine has been attacked and is suffering from an invasion that Ukrainians consider to be genocidal. There's no equivalence here, and there's no idea of two partners sitting down at a table for talks on compromises. It's very important to send a message to Russia that the international community objects to what it's done. The international community does not accept Russia's right to invade its neighbours. Now, that, of course, is not popular with Russia. Of course, Russia will dislike that and may feel that it's being isolated, alienated, as you say, certainly. But I think that's a very important message for Russia. It won't make them stop the invasion overnight, but it will add to the overall calculus that this invasion is not going how they hoped it would go, and it will not, in future, go how they hope it would go. So I think from a Ukrainian point of view, certainly the meeting achieved many of its objectives. And if you look at Russia's very angry and in many ways emotional response, I think that confirms that Russians did feel that they'd been isolated and did feel hard done by this meeting. That's not going to bring immediate results in a positive sense, but in the long term, it may well be clear that that was actually a useful exercise.
How does that help an intransigent Russia when they already know they're isolated, they already know they're primarily alienated in the Committee of Nations? We only have to look at the United Nations to see how many people voted against the invasion of Ukraine last year, and all the sanctions as well. So is this more of Ukraine trying to consolidate its support and possibly garner more support as a primary motive of the Saudi Arabia conference, as opposed to trying to look for a way to end the war peacefully?
Well, I think we have to bear in mind what Russia's key goals are at the moment. Russia's main hope now is that it will be able to outlast the West. Russia is of the opinion that the West will ultimately grow tired of this war and will ultimately seek some sort of a compromise, will essentially abandon Ukraine. And of course, if that's true of the West, as Russia believes, it's certainly true of the wider international community. So it's very important to dispel these expectations from the Russian side, to show them this is not the case. Now, I would underline that this peace summit in Saudi Arabia was not Ukraine's initiative. It was the Saudi initiative. The Saudis came up with the idea. The Saudis, of course, in consultation with partners, including Ukraine, but the Saudis organized the guest list. It was their decision not to invite Russia. It was their decision to invite China. It was China's choice to attend. So, again, it does send a message to Russia that Russians don't like, but it does send a message to them, which in many ways is probably a lot stronger than a non-binding United Nations General Assembly vote, where the countries Russia considers to be partners are essentially engaging in talks that are considered in Moscow to be anti-Russian and lending their weight to such talks. So I think it sends a strong message not only to Putin himself, but to the whole Russian elite that they are on the losing side here, that they are on a road to nowhere, and their president can no longer guarantee the stability of their country or their position internationally. The isolation will not end soon, and it will not be a scenario like Georgia in 2008 or Crimea in 2014, when the international community complained and criticized Russia, but then essentially went back to business as usual. That will not happen on this occasion, and that is a very important message to send to Russia. It doesn't bring results in the immediate future, but it may well pave the way, set the stage, as it were, for some form of diplomatic solution in the future.
My next question, Mr. Dickinson, sort of encapsulates the fears of the international community concerning this conflict. Have we reached the point of no return? And I may add to that, when do we reach a point of no return where this becomes an endless war and a conflagration?
Well, the idea of it being, the first part of your question, is it a point of no return? I think in terms of relations between the international community and the regime of Vladimir Putin in Russia, yes, we have reached a point of no return. It will be very difficult to return to a business as usual relationship with Putin, where he was considered to be just another international leader. The scale of the war crimes that have been committed in Ukraine is simply too grave, is too large to imagine Putin now being a respected member at international forums and conferences. It's difficult to imagine any world leaders, certainly any Western leaders, wishing to engage directly with Putin at this stage. He is now a wanted international war criminal by the ICC in The Hague, and we expect more charges to be brought against him as the evidence mounts of Russian war crimes in Ukraine. Now, does that mean the war is endless and will go on forever? Well, I would suggest not. There is no immediate military solution on the horizon, but we have seen a lot of very surprising and shocking military events over the last year and a half. 18 months ago, we were all told that Kiev would fall within perhaps 3 days, perhaps a week. That was the consensus amongst the international military analytical community. Certainly that was the expectation in Russia. Russia, we were told, was the world's #2 military power. Now, over the past year and a half, we've seen Ukraine secure victory after victory on the battlefield. Today, we're seeing Ukraine struggling in its counteroffensive. It's having great difficulty making progress against Russia's defenses. But it does not take a vivid imagination to conceive of some form of breakthrough, at which point we could see very dramatic military collapses on the Russian side. Again, I'm sure your audience is very, very much aware of the recent brief Wagner mutiny in Russia, where within a matter of hours, all of a sudden the whole future of the Putin regime was in question, and there was very little sign of any resistance from anyone within Russia to this apparent military takeover. That may well have been a precursor of a much bigger uprising if the military situation deteriorates in Ukraine. So a lot can happen, and it could well be fast. It could well be a lot faster than we imagine. I don't think that the Putin regime at the moment is on very stable ground. I don't think it would take much to shake those foundations. And if that were to happen, I think that that Putin's own priorities would very quickly become the survival of his regime domestically in Russia, rather than the continuation of a war in Ukraine. So yes, I think it's very difficult to see a return to business as usual with Russia under its current leadership. But that does not necessarily mean that the war in Ukraine will continue endlessly.
Finally, Mr. Dickinson, as far as interventions go, if Republican former U.S. President Donald Trump beats his first indictment, second indictment, third indictment. This is the fourth indictment, I think, or going to the fifth, if that happens, and becomes the GOP candidate and defeats whoever emerges as a Democrat candidate, if it's President Joe Biden or someone else, given he said that he can end this conflict in 24 hours if he's back in the saddle. Is this something that the world should look forward to?
I'm not sure if I would use the term look forward to. Certainly it would be a major development. There's a lot of concern in Ukraine about the potential impact of a second Trump presidency on American support for Ukraine. Certainly, there's considerable concern. I would be cautious. I think at this stage we are currently in the primary stage of the American campaign. So President Trump, former President Donald Trump, is campaigning to win the candidacy, to become the official Republican candidate. As such, he needs to appeal to the whole Republican base. So he's being quite careful about what he says on the Ukraine issue. He doesn't want to isolate those within the Republican Party who are skeptical or even opposed to continued US support for Ukraine. That's part of his rhetoric about finding a solution in one day, resolving the problem. I believe that once he receives the candidacy, once he is confirmed, if that indeed happens, and that's by far not a foregone conclusion, but if that is the case, I think we will see a much more moderate stance on Ukraine. If you look at the Republican Party as a whole in Congress and Republican voters, there is widespread backing for support of Ukraine. If we look at, for American support of Ukraine, rather, if we look at America as a whole, there is strong majority support for backing of Ukraine, for continued backing of Ukraine. There is recognition that it's very important for America that Ukraine triumphs or at least it does not suffer a defeat against Russia. So I think it will be very difficult for any future Trump presidency to say, okay, we're cutting all ties, we're going to abandon Ukraine. I think we'd probably see a lot of rhetoric. We might well see some grandstanding on certain aspects, but I think he would want to eventually come in and he would want to be a winner. He would want to go in and win in Ukraine. And all this talk about finishing the conflict in a day would be very quickly forgotten.
He does get along, or he did get along with both parties, that is Zelensky and Putin, I guess. But we'll leave it there. Thank you for your exhaustive, comprehensive and insightful contribution on the issue this morning on Russian invasion of Ukraine. Mr. Peter Dickinson, publisher of Business Ukraine magazine, Lviv Today, also the editor at the Odessa Review, who joined us out of Ukraine. Many thanks.
Thank you.
After the break, United States and Canada issue new sanctions against Belarus. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome to the sophomore stretch of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Russia says it'll build up forces at its western borders following Finland's accession to the US-led NATO alliance. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu told the governing board of the ministry that NATO member Poland had already announced plans to strengthen its military and that he expected significant NATO forces and weaponry to be deployed in Finland, whose inclusion has almost doubled the length of Russia's land border with NATO. In opening remarks at the colloquium of the Defense Ministry, Mr. Shoigu called the entry of Finland into NATO and the future entry of Sweden a serious destabilizing factor. The two Nordic states abandoned generations of neutrality that had held throughout the Cold War to seek NATO membership following the start of Moscow's special military operation in Ukraine early last year. Mr. Shoigu added that Poland had announced its intention to build the most powerful army on the continent and had become the main instrument of the anti-Russian policy of the United States of America. According to him, the number of NATO military units from outside the region stationed in Eastern Europe had increased by 2.5 times since February last year, and that there were now 30,000 strong in total.
Threats
to the military security of the Russian Federation have multiplied in the strategic western and northwestern directions. A serious destabilizing factor is Finland joining NATO, and in the future, Sweden too. After Helsinki joined the alliance, Russia's land border with the bloc's countries almost doubled. On Finnish territory, it is likely that additional NATO military contingents and strike weapons will be deployed, capable of hitting critical targets in the northwest of Russia at a considerable depth.
Canada has imposed new sanctions on Belarusian officials over human rights violations in that country. These measures taken in coordination with the United States, the UK, and the European Union. Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly said in a statement that the Belarusian regime must answer for its acts which affect those both inside and outside its borders. In their words, along with international partners, Canada stands against Belarus' ongoing efforts to silence political dissent and to destabilize the region. We will not allow the Lukashenko regime to continue to violate its international obligations with impunity, human rights not negotiable. The federal government announced that 24 individuals and 7 entities will face sanctions under the Special Economic Measures Act in response to actions taken by the regime of President Alexander Lukashenko following the presidential elections in August of 2020 that the West and many outside observers said were fraudulent. Mr. Lukashenko has used the Belarusian government security forces to crack down brutally on public protests with arbitrary detention and excessive force. Canada says Mr. Lukashenko's regime has not been deterred by sanctions imposed in August and continues to arbitrarily arrest people and restrict freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly. Similar to its neighbors, the United States has issued new sanctions against Belarus, with the Treasury Department adding that it was designating 8 individuals and 5 entities to a list for allegedly funding the Belarusian government. In a statement, the department says the action targets several entities involved in the Belarusian regime, continued civil society repression, complicity in the Russian Federation's unjustified war in Ukraine, and enrichment of repressive Belarusian regime leader Alexander Lukashenko. Mr. Lukashenko has repeatedly accused the West of trying to topple him after mass protests against his rule erupted in 2020 in the wake of a presidential election, and opposition said he'd fraudulently won Lukashenko the election, although he said he did it fairly, while conducting a sweeping crackdown on his opponents. Western sanctions have been imposed on Belarus over the years in relation to the alleged crackdown and election fraud. Minsk also allowed Moscow to use Belarusian territory to send troops into Ukraine on February the 24th last year. The individuals and entities targeted in the sanctions include 3 state-owned enterprises and the director of a subsidiary of one of those enterprises. Russia's central bank on Wednesday said it will stop carrying out the finance ministry's foreign currency purchases on the domestic market from August the 10th in an effort to reduce volatility on financial markets. The ruble hit its lowest level for more than 16 months on Wednesday, past 98 to the dollar, hampered by strong foreign currency demand and a lack of supply, with Russia's shrinking trade surplus and widening budget deficit also hurting sentiment. And now we bring up the business perspective of how the war in Ukraine affects the world of business and vice versa. Joining me is Channel Television business correspondent Ini John Mekwa. Ini, good morning.
Good morning.
Now, we know that Russia has been trying to wean itself of dependence on any sorts of other countries where it's also evading sanctions. And they also talked about the automobile industry and the production of Russian cars as opposed to foreign cars. Now that the central bank has halted the purchase of foreign currency, that is the Russian central bank halting the purchase of foreign currency. Is this all foreign currency?
Well, I guess not all, because like the yuan, they had said they will be trading the yuan on the foreign currency exchange in their market there. But just as you read, what they're trying to do is to try to boost the ruble. You know, we've talked about how the ruble lost value. And yesterday, I think yesterday was a negative currency day, because even the naira dropped to its lowest, more than 900 yesterday to the dollar. We also saw that happening to the ruble yesterday. So these are some of the quick measures that Russia wants to put in place. For instance, if they stop buying the foreign currency into the country, that means that there will not be foreign currency in Russia. So the demand for ruble will increase. And when the demand increases, then it adds value. So, you know, we've talked about how we got here to start with, which is that a lot of companies, Western companies, have left the country. And so at the period end of the month, when the ruble normally would gain because of tax payment, we see the ruble dropping because of demand. Demand has also reduced and all of that. So that's what they're trying to do here, not allowing foreign currency into the country. But they do have exceptions, you know, like the friendly countries. We know that they are friendly with China, you know, and they even trade it. And
China gets a pass?
I guess.
The dollar gets a
gets a no. You know, but it's just one of the ways. We don't know how they can sustain it, because they've tried it before and then they had to lift the ban and start trading with some of this foreign currency. Because, for instance, some of their neighbors still have to pay for oil and gas with, you know, those who are still trading with them with dollars, at least to an extent.
Right. And India is exploring options in buying Russian oil. I thought they were already buying Russian oil.
Yeah.
Is this to bring in more?
No. So they're buying Russian oil, and they are one of those who pay for Russian oil with the dollars. But remember, we talked about how oil price is surging because of the production cut from Saudi Arabia and Russia. Now, oil Brent is surpassing $80. WTI is about $80. That is above the price cap. And if India India cannot even access the dollar to buy Russian oil once it's above the price cap, because they will get sanctioned and most likely will not get supply. That's why they're looking for alternatives now. So what they are doing is to turn to a third-party country like Singapore and Hong Kong. So they use entities in those countries to buy Russian oil.
Right. And
then they now get it. So that way, they can now, of course, pay with Singaporean currency, their dollar, and even in Hong Kong, the Hong Kongian dollar, and used to pay for the Russian oil, and then later on to be transported. So they're just looking for ways to survive, because they still need this, and even Russia still needs the revenue. We've talked about how their revenue has dwindled, which is part of the reason why the ruble is losing value, because their trade surplus has reduced. I think it's reduced about over 30%. You know, at this time, a lot of people are not trading with them anymore. Their commodities are now with them instead of being exported out of the country. So at this point now, India still needs the oil, even though they've bought a whole lot of it, and they still need it. Of course, the excuse is always that they have a large population, so they really need it, and it's cheap oil for them and all of that. But with the price now, so you see, when you look at the bigger picture, it's win here and lose here. So Russia is supposed to be making more money now that oil prices are surging, but now they have a cut in demand, because once it goes above the price cap, then certain countries have to be creative, just like what India is doing, to circumvent the sanction if they have to continue buying Russian oil.
So it appears President Modi's visit to the United States a while back hasn't yielded much results in convincing them to reduce their relations commercially with Russia, nor China, for that matter, because without these two countries, there'll be a big dent in Russian economy. Yeah,
very, very big one. And that's why I said earlier that, I mean, Russia has always been saying, even from the beginning, when they put the sanctions and all of that, they've always said, well, they have a large population, they need this, and it's an opportunity, and they're not, that's rich as the Western countries, you know, to be able to look for other sophisticated sources for their oil and gas needs. So that's their excuse for patronizing Russia. And now that it's more than the price cap, they still can't win off Russian oil and gas. They still have to find ways to go about it.
What's the general impression of the Ukrainian war economy? You're alluding to this now in this conversation. We've seen Ukraine also emerge as being very hardy and being very resilient and also looking for ways, and obviously because of their partners. But the current state of the Ukraine war economy needs a lot more money, though.
Yeah, it does, and it's making a lot more money. In fact, according to my findings, the defense, that's the war economy, the people who make the ammunition and all of the little things they can make in Ukraine, they are the only ones that are increasing salary at this time. You know, at a time when the country seems to be losing and everything. One part of it, I mean, not a very happy one, because we know where those weapons end. We know what they do. Some of them may even end up being the ones to be used to destroy their own country. But at least you have that part. They say now the state defense alone has about 60,000 people in their employment. And
do you know that, sorry to interrupt you, that as a matter of fact, a contractor purchased Belgian tanks and is selling to a third party that is undisclosed on the international market. And the money involved, it's so huge. And the fact that it's such a capital intensive enterprise that is reported in public media, but we don't know who he's selling to. Obviously, we're thinking it's Ukraine. But so when it's in a time of war, defense makes money.
Yeah.
In the time of a pandemic, the pharmaceutical companies make money.
So somebody has to lose and somebody has to win. And don't forget, there were talks also that the U.S. most likely, or some people in the U.S. are also making money from this war, because a lot of the weapons coming from the United States to Ukraine are being made by companies. People own those companies, you know. So it's a time of war. There's loss of lives, destruction of infrastructure, and economies are being burned down. But you have the war economy thriving, and you know, maybe people who have experience in IT and all of that will find some place in the defense, both the private and the public sector. The defense sector in Ukraine is thriving at this time, and some people even say that might be where the recovery of the economy may come from. Hopefully when the war is ended, that because they're developing their infrastructure, developing their skills so much that even when the war ends, they will be exporting not just agriculture, but also exporting some of those war weapons. But I mean, when you think about that, where are they exporting it to? Who is going to be using that at that time?
There must be an easier way to make money. Thanks, Ini.
Thank you for having me.
Ini John Mekwa. When we return, German national arrested on suspicion of spying for Russia. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome to the final stretch of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Germany and Ukraine have agreed on the supply of additional Patriot air defense missile systems to Kyiv. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said this in his evening address on Wednesday. Earlier, Germany announced its decision to ship 2 more Patriot launchers to Ukraine.
Today, there is good news from Germany. Exactly what we agreed with Olaf Scholz. There are additional Patriot systems. Thank you very much, Olaf. It is necessary for the defense of our people against Russian terror. Thank you, Germany, Chancellor personally, for fulfilling this agreement. It will definitely save thousands of lives of our people. This will definitely bring us closer to creating a full-fledged air shield for Ukraine. This will help people, cities, and villages.
A government official, that's Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, a government official has been arrested in Germany accused of passing secret information to Russia. The man has been named only as Thomas H. in line with German privacy rules. He is said to have worked for an office dealing with military equipment and information technology. It's alleged he went on his own initiative to the Russian embassy in Berlin and also to its consulate in the city of Bonn, where he offered his services. On Wednesday, he was brought before a judge and was detained pending a trial. The federal prosecutor's office said the man allegedly handed over information obtained during the course of his work in the intention that it be passed on to a Russian intelligence service. He was arrested in Western Germany and his home and workplace were searched. Finally on the program, amidst the turmoil, China has declared its intention to persist with efforts aimed at facilitating a peaceful resolution to the war in Ukraine. Echoing their commitment to international cooperation, representatives at the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a statement confirming Beijing's endorsement of political dialogue to de-escalate the grim situation. With this announcement, the ministry says China aims to enhance dialogue and interaction with all parties involved to stimulate a political fix to the Ukrainian crisis. And that's it for today's edition of Russian Invasion of Ukraine. Many thanks for watching. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Have a good day.